Me every time he asks me to speak, he gives me the session after lunch. A couple of things I can promise you from the session. I assume everyone saw the opening keynote speaker this morning. There's going to be slightly more swearing in this session. Maybe a little bit more than that, actually. I'm actually going to build on, purely unbeknownst to me, a number of his themes. There's going to be 3 core questions and 2 megatrends we're going to use just to answer, or at least start posing some of the further questions that we need to ask ourselves. So, the future of work. And I get my... It's something we looked at and started looking at research-wise globally about 5 years ago. And Mark said a couple of things which we totally agree with, but I will say a lot of the work and the research we did was with McKinsey's. Just to say that. And McKinsey's were actually really honest. They said they've got no idea about the future of work. All they can do is have a look at what the data tells them and start providing some insight and some thought about what it could look like. And Mark was totally right around predictions. So today's session is going to have no predictions. Okay? It is a lot easier talking about the negatives rather than the positives. And again, if you saw Mark's session, if you were like me, I was crying towards the end of it. And then finally, I started feeling a little bit happier. So, what are we really going to cover off? And the 3 questions are quite important because it's a pivotal time. Certainly 2018 for me feels pivotal. If you start thinking about it, why is it pivotal? Well, there's the obvious topic of Brexit and what that's going to do. And you'll probably get a theme of this session about my views around Brexit, simply because one of the biggest investments that Aon have made in the last 3 years is in our insolvency practice. And if that gives you any idea of our view of the economic output from March onwards, that should at least solve some of the questions. So what are the underlying forces? What are the mega trends that are moving around at lightning pace? I think the nature of work and what it means to us covers in 3 questions. So what actually is a mobile, flexible workforce? And I answer this, or at least ask the questions around this, around what's different to the past? Well, the 9 to 5's gone. That's obvious. The office has gone. At Aon, we moved into a new building 2-3 years ago. All of the front office staff are home workers. All of us. Interestingly, our retention rates at Aon have improved dramatically. Our turnover rates have reduced, obviously. Email, it's dead. How many of you actually use email as a core communication channel? And you actually think about it, what's the measure of success on email? It's minimal. Indeed, another example I use, the Aon Global Board, in their infinite wisdom, decided to improve email 3-4 years ago by putting the pictures of the global board on each email. They thought that would be great. It'd start to create a personal connection with the staff. You start to see their face, you start to feel something about them. What we actually found, that the opening of the emails decreased. And when we bothered to go out and speak to our staff, they said, well, whenever I saw Greg Case, the global CEO, on an email, I thought it wasn't relevant to me, so I just deleted it. I didn't even go down further. So email is dead. Paternalism, lack of diversity, it's dead. The limited company. Again, Mark was showing you an interesting stat that around companies that they've got a 7-year lifespan now. 7 years on average. If you go back 30, 35 years, you're talking about a 50-year lifespan. So the limited company and the way that we actually work today is dead. So some of the ideas that are replacing before our eyes, but there's a number of possibilities and considerations that I'm going to look at. I'm going to particularly throw out the gig economy and through that lens and look at Uber, look at Deliveroo, even look at Amazon. And what I'm not going to be saying is that they're perfect, because they're not. And there's a huge amount of negativity around some of the things. But what they've done is fundamentally look at the workplace and the way that we work in a different way. So if we look at question 2, how are employers innovating in this space? When we look and think and look at research around what's coming and how to position it, one of the things that we found with every piece of research is that the traditional employee benefit strategy is dead. How many of you spend the majority of your reward and benefit spend on pensions? Waste of time. Utterly a waste of time. Next, medical. PMI. Mark touched on it this morning. If anyone talks to me about medical inflation, I will kill them. It's the biggest con in the history of the world. I'd love if any of the providers here to argue differently. Medical inflation. You are just paying again for the shareholder returns at all these different companies. Complete waste of time. Yeah, it's normally second in your list. Go through the amount of money you spend on flex benefits. One of my jobs, I head up a flex practice and a technology practice at Aon. Waste of time. Why? One of the questions we force you to ask around innovation is, if you dumped all of those tonight, at midnight tonight, so what? What difference would that cause your business? How would that decrease productivity? How would that impact any of the quality of the work? Ultimately, what would that do around engagement? Would it actually change any of your engagement scores? Well, that would be really nice to do. I've actually always wanted to do that with at least one company and just try and look at the data and see what that actually does. You can't really do that. Obviously, there are some state and legislative reasons why you still have to provide certain levels of pension. There are some moral and ethical considerations that you need to think about. There's also obviously generational and other considerations. But if you really look at a generational view, you are seeing that millennials, you are seeing that Generation Y, you're seeing that Generation Alpha, who are about to come in the workforce in the next few years, only see those benefits as hygiene factors. It doesn't change the engagement dial. It becomes a fundamental shift when you look at the traditional benefit strategy and you see all these benefits with all of the spend at one end, and yet the stuff that people want is at the other end and gets the least amount of attention and the least amount of spend. One of the ways that we do ask you to consider it and just think about it, it's a little test you can do in your own heads. I look at the benefits that you provide and the way that you communicate, and I see it as a continuum. From on the left-hand side, what we call as cover your arse benefits, or cover your arse comms. These are the stuff that you just do. Think of booklets, think of statements, think of websites, or most websites I look at. They're over here. Think of your contract of employment. Think of all of your words on the extranet site. They're on your left-hand side. These are stuff that have never been built to engage with people. They've been built to protect or to deal with people risk, protect the business. And you've got other boxes right the way up to the other end, which is true engagement. And there's an acronym that we use all of the time around true engagement, and it's what we call RISE. And you'd have heard it through all the different sessions in different ways. RISE, the first one is relevant. And you've heard the concept this morning again, hyper-personalization. Okay, critical. If you don't give me something that is relevant, you've lost me. If you don't understand who I am as a person, that's the only way you can actually understand whether it's relevant to me or not. Second one is impactful. I'm going to make impact. How many people actually picked up their mobile phones this morning, first thing they did, and went onto social media? Am I the only sad person that really did this? If you're honest with yourself, you leant over the bed, you unplugged it, you checked your notifications first off. You've got all of this noise, and to try and communicate the reward and benefits and create innovation, you've got to get through that noise. The third one is simple, or simplicity. It's so easy. Mark Twain was quoted this morning, another phrase that Mark Twain's famous for. It's far easier to write 1,000 words than 10. Every piece of communication that I get thrown when we do a communication audit, I read it and I just start laughing. It's written not to be read and understood. It's written to protect the employer, and it's often written by someone that's from a Generation X or even a baby boomer perspective. It becomes quite painful. The last one, which is the one that most employers struggle with around innovation and connecting and engaging with employees, is emotion. Your communications, your engagement, the benefits, they've got to connect at an emotional level to the employee. Back to Mark's concept of citizen this morning. You've got to treat people as people. You've got to treat them as humans. And if you connect on an emotional level, you'll get buy-in. People can see through the bullshit. They can see through the reasons why you provide things and the way that you're communicating. So I genuinely recommend, you don't have to pay people like us to go and do this and waste all your money. You can do the session yourself. Works really well with a whiteboard in a session. Put up Post-it notes and test yourself. You'll be amazed at how many of those communication and those benefits are on the left-hand side rather than the right-hand side. What's the third question? Data or tech, chicken or egg? There's so much data out there, and there's so much data on underpinning technology. But the way that we look at this is that data is just the beginning of the journey, not the end. What comes next? Well, with each element of data, you've got to provide insight. Today is about providing insight around all the elements of data that we've got. That sort of makes sense, doesn't it? You can get the raw data and you can look at it and you could say, okay, I can now interpret that within my contextual part of what I'm doing and what I'm trying to achieve. That's fine. But unless the insight is actually generating any action, any definable action, it's a waste of time. Might as well give up. Don't collect the data if you're not going to do anything with it. But that action, again, the final piece has got to have an impact. It's got to change something. It's got to change behaviours. Again, Mark said this morning around the fact that we all start with our own biases. We all start with our own context. We all see the world completely differently. Unless you can create a definable action that's going to have an impact for what you're trying to achieve, it's a complete and utter waste of time. Interestingly, I was going to talk about wearable devices. I've got one on my wrist. There's last count, which was this morning, there's 345 million wearable devices used. How many people have got a wearable device on? I actually had someone calling me then. It was actually buzzing on my wrist then. With these devices, again, and I was smiling and chatting to Mark after his session, we've been looking an awful lot at blockchain. He explained it this morning. But how does blockchain manifest itself in this industry or this particular part? Anyone seen the new iPhone and the new devices that it's got around health? Blockchain means that you can take all your health data and you can share it with people for a definable piece of time. You can take all your financial data and share it at a definable piece of time. All the data that's coming through here, the biggest element around elder care at the moment are these things, because the new iWatches can monitor heart rate and they can monitor blood pressure. If you're elderly, instead of having your alarm around your neck and have to press it, it can do it automatically. So you start to see that wearable tech is coming through because of some of the data, but it can't be seen as an add-on. And again, going back to our rise and our concept there, unless you make it relevant to people, impactful and simple, but connect at an emotional level, they won't use it. So, having a look at the data, 2 mega trends I said I'd look at. First one is this, and I know there's some of my clients here, some of our clients here today, and they might have seen this graph. I think it's useful. One on the left, that is how we educate our children. It's an utter joke. We educate them. They're born, you're dependent, you go through a learning phase, you're then thrown at work for a period of time, you then retire and do something if you can, if you've got enough money, and then you die. Maybe between that, you need a bit of help because you can't wipe your own backside and do other things. Is that relevant today? That's how most benefit and reward programs operate. That's how most of the programs, when you truly look at it, operate. If you start looking at the future workforce or the workforce of today, it is more akin to something we say as a mosaic or a parallel workplace. And then force yourself to consider, how does that actually apply to your business? And what about your reward and benefit strategy around that mosaic and parallel thing? Anyone done a sabbatical here? I have. I hated working where I was. I took a year out and travelled. And I remember being in the sea in the Philippines and saying, I'm never getting back into this industry ever again. A week later, I got in the UK, I was working somewhere else. So you've got this. How many people are continually learning, whether it's technical learning, whether it's their own personal learning? How many people see themselves still working for their same employer in the next 5 to 10 years? Thank you. The Aon people put their hands up. That's very good. That was very well noted. It's absolutely essential. It's absolutely essential to consider how that actually applies and how it works for your particular organisation. Let's look at number 2. You'd have seen versions of this elsewhere. You can't actually see the colours, so apologise for the standard of the actual graph when I look at it here. But what it's really saying is a number of things. First thing, it's about 2025 when there will be more millennials than any other generation in the workplace. I said that, more millennials than any other generation. You can plot where you are on that. I hate this graph because it does show me exactly how old I am. If you start thinking through that the benefits and everything else that you've put in place, how relevant are they for the fact that majority of your workforce from a generational perspective, will be millennials. There will then be Generation Y. There will then be Generation Alpha coming through. Let's take a step back when I said about that diversity is changing, for a prime example. One of the key elements that I'm not seeing change around diversity is diversity around decision making. In reward and benefits, who are making the decision around the way you communicate, the types of benefits, and the type of reward practices you're putting in place? How diverse is that decision-making process? Are you actually getting input and reliable and regular input from our Generation Ys, our Millennials, Generation Alpha? It's a huge thing, especially around communications. Going back to my 4 stages, why have we got so many cover your ass piece of comms? Because it's often men over the age of 50 making that decision, ultimately with the budgets. Not people like yourself, but people that are going above that and making decisions on the budget. And the answer is, yeah, let's do another booklet. Or let's chuck it to the lawyers and they can put another 25 caveats at the bottom of something so no one ever reads something. You can go and buy the newest and the fanciest technology, but unless you're going to consider the effect of these type of mega trends on what you're doing and why you're doing it, it's a complete waste of money. That does apply to Aon technology as well as other people's technology. So, our place in the sun is never set in stone. Let's actually go and have a look at some of the companies that we said. So, Uber, Deliveroo, Amazon. What do they do differently? If we go back to our mosaic, it gives people the chance to actually live their lives and do things differently. When you look and see and you ask people what they actually want from the workplace, I've got a slide in a minute that tells you the difference between millennials and other generations. That's all great. But what we tend to find is when you segment your audience, there are 3 different ways to do it. One is a demographic. That's easy. That looks at generations, that looks at age, that looks at gender, that looks at occupation, class, location. That doesn't really tell you that much. It tells you someone could fit into a box. We then look at stage 2. We talk about behavioural and what people did in the past. What's the danger of looking backwards at decisions made? If you look at investments, they've always got a great phrase at the bottom: past performance is no guarantee to future performance. And yet we still look at decisions that people have made in the past and try and then work from there. The biggest challenge, but the biggest plus, is trying to focus on what we call attitudinal. Trying to understand who people are and designing the reward and benefits with the communication strategy around the fact that people are people. Uber, as one example, have designed a new boring insurance program. Does anyone know how the insurance program works? I use it because it's always good to use boring stuff rather than exciting stuff, because it's actually quite fundamental. Anyone know how their business insurance policy works if you're an Uber driver? It actually works as soon as you start. You get your phone out, you start work, there's a process which you start work, and the insurance policy kicks in at that point. And ultimately, they pay from that point. When you finish work, the insurance policy stops. If you just bring it to our world, travel insurance. Why on earth do we buy annual travel policies? We all do it. I've got one through the Aon Flex scheme. It's amazing. Complete waste of money. Why? Because this year I didn't go away that much. Didn't use it, yet I paid the same cost as I did the year before when I went away a huge amount. So what you're starting to see in the benefits space are things that become more relevant, become more hyper-personalized. You'll start to see insurance companies, consultancies, pieces of technology that enable people to actually deliver something that's relevant to them and not that's relevant to the business. And that's all fine. But again, going back to the relevance point, when we start looking at the differences between the different generations, you see millennials are looking for on-demand employment opportunities. That's great. But actually just viewing them as just millennials, and what we tend to see is people that use generational analysis will just then go and devise a solution for millennials, not understanding that Generation X, people like me, actually do value this as well. So from a demographic perspective, it's worth considering how it actually applies. And how do you do that? You actually ask your employees and have faith in the ability to ask them and take action on their feedback. I don't mean engagement surveys. Everyone does engagement surveys. What's the biggest feedback on engagement surveys? Yeah, people don't do anything. You go and ask your employees the amount of times, we've just done another global survey of our own staff. It tells us loads of stuff. And what it also told us is that all the staff think we didn't do anything about last year's or the year before. No, we did. We actually did do stuff. And most organisations do, but trying to get over the fact that people think you haven't. I'm going to leave you with just an action section. And from my perspective, it just gives you an acronym that gives you some vague ideas about how to approach this type of thing. Actually speak to your employees. Look at communications that are actually hitting people at the right time, at the right place, in the right way. Talk to them as people, not as employees. Understand and have faith in yourself when you're reviewing the benefits and the reward that you do. You can use tech to personalize, but there's a reason that tech comes last and not first. I'll whiz through that because I'm now overrunning, and to leave you with just one thought. Any questions? We haven't got time. Okay, and I was really pleased I didn't swear that much as well. So thank you all, and any questions, by all means, see me after.